You're not the kind of man women brag about to their friends, my wife said while comparing me to a successful executive she worked with every day. I quietly accepted her decision. Months later, she learned which one of us was actually building something worth admiring. You're not the kind of man women brag about to their friends. She said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing for a while. Calm, measured, like she'd finally found the exact right words. I stood there in our kitchen, coffee in my hand, and didn't say anything. Not because I had nothing to say, but because something in her voice told me this wasn't really a conversation. It was a verdict. At the time, I thought she was simply ending our marriage. Months later, she'd discover she had misunderstood both of us. The night she said it, we'd just come home from dinner with her coworkers. Clayton had been there. He always seemed to be there lately. He wore the kind of watch that people notice from across a table. He talked about his portfolio the way other people talk about the weather, casually, like it required no effort. He laughed loudly at his own jokes, and somehow made it charming instead of insufferable. Abigail had laughed too, more than I'd heard her laugh in months. On the drive home, she was quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet we used to share, the kind that has weight to it. When we got inside, she set her purse on the counter and looked at me like she was measuring something she'd been measuring for a long time. You're not the kind of man women brag about to their friends. I set my coffee down slowly. What does that mean? I asked. It means exactly what I said. She wasn't cruel about it. That almost made it worse. She wasn't trying to wound me. She was just stating something she believed to be true, like she was reading a fact from a page. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded once, slowly, and said, okay. She looked surprised by that, like she'd expected a fight. I didn't have one to give her, not because I agreed with her, but because I understood, in that moment, that we had been living in two completely different versions of our life for a very long time, and I didn't know how to explain mine to someone who had already decided they didn't want to hear it. Abigail and I had been married for 6 years. We met in our late 20s, which means we were old enough to know what we wanted and young enough to believe we could build it together. She was sharp, driven, the kind of person who always knew what she was walking into a room to accomplish. I loved that about her. Still do, honestly. I was different, quieter about my ambitions. I had plans, but I didn't talk about them much. I was 37 when this all came apart. She was 34. We lived in a nice part of the city, close enough to her office that she could walk when the weather allowed, far enough from downtown that we had a little space to breathe. I worked in commercial development. Not glamorous. Not the kind of thing that makes for interesting party conversation. I spent most of my time evaluating projects, building partnerships, and slowly acquiring pieces of a larger strategy I'd been assembling for years. Nobody saw the strategy. That was partly by design. I'd watched too many people announce their plans before they had the foundation to support them. I didn't want to be that guy, so I kept my head down and built. Abigail knew I worked hard. She just didn't always know what I was working toward. Looking back, I think that's where the crack started. Clayton joined her company about 18 months before the end. She mentioned him the first week. New VP started today. Incredibly polished. Very well connected. I didn't think much of it. 2 months later, he came up again. This time with a story attached. He'd closed some deal that apparently impressed everyone in the office. She told me about it over dinner like she was reporting the news. I listened, asked a few questions, moved on. But he kept coming up. Lunch conversations with Clayton. A conference where Clayton had apparently given a remarkable presentation. A fundraiser Clayton had organized. A new car Clayton had recently acquired. A vacation Clayton had just returned from. He just seems to have figured something out, she said once. Figured what out? I asked. She thought about it. How to make everything look intentional. I should have paid more attention to that line. At the time, I filed it away as admiration for a successful colleague. I didn't realize it was also, quietly, a criticism of me. The comparisons didn't come all at once. They crept in. First, it was small things. Clayton apparently wore better suits. Clayton had a certain presence in a room. Clayton knew exactly what wine to order without looking at the label. Then it became slightly larger things. We were at a mutual friend's birthday dinner when she leaned over and whispered that Clayton had recently been mentioned in a business profile. It's a big deal, she said. The kind of thing that opens doors. Good for him, I said. She looked at me sideways. You've been working for years. Has anyone written about you? Not yet, I said. She turned back to her plate. I noticed the word, yet, didn't seem to register. Then came the questions I wasn't expecting. Why didn't I go to more industry events? Why didn't I network the way other people networked? Why didn't I talk about what I was doing? Why didn't I have a title that meant something at a dinner party? You're in development, she said once. But what does that actually mean to someone who doesn't know you? It means I'm building things, I said. But no one can see that. And there it was. That wasn't the last comparison. I didn't know yet where it was heading. But something in the air had changed, and I could feel it. My best friend Randall has a gift for saying exactly what you don't want to hear in a way that makes it impossible to argue with. We grabbed lunch about 4 months before the end. He'd been watching me at a few social gatherings, he said, and he wanted to ask me something directly. Does Abigail think you're successful? I stared at him. She knows what I do? I said. That's not what I asked. I took a drink of water. I think, I said carefully, she has a specific idea of what success looks like. And I don't fit it right now. Randall nodded slowly. That guy from her office. Clayton. Yeah. He paused. You know what he is, right? Her co-worker. He's a mirror, Randall said. Everything she wants to see reflected back at her. Nice watch. Right title. Says the right things at the right events. But mirrors don't actually produce anything. They just show you what you bring to them. I laughed a little. That's generous of him. I'm serious, Randall said. You need to ask yourself something. Not about him. About her. Because the issue isn't that she thinks he's impressive. The issue is that she stopped thinking you are. I drove home that afternoon and sat in the driveway for a long time. He wasn't wrong. The last 5 months of our marriage felt like watching a slow leak you can't quite locate. Something was draining, but the source kept moving every time I thought I'd found it. There was the night she came home from a work event glowing in a way she didn't glow when she came home to me. There was the afternoon I overheard her on the phone with her friend Savannah, describing Clayton's new apartment. It's the kind of place where you walk in and immediately understand the person, she said. A pause. Ours is nice. It's just comfortable, you know? Just comfortable. I stood in the hallway and let that land. There was the birthday dinner where she introduced me to a colleague as my husband. He works in real estate adjacent things. Real estate adjacent things. I'd spent the last 3 years building the groundwork for something significant, and I had become, in her shorthand, adjacent. I didn't call her out on it. I just noted it. Then came the conversation I should have taken more seriously. Her sister Rebecca came to visit for a weekend, and at some point the two of them ended up on the back porch while I was inside. I wasn't trying to listen, but the windows were open and the evening was quiet. Don't you want someone who makes you feel like you're winning? Rebecca was saying. That's a strange way to put it, Abigail replied. You know what I mean. Someone who makes you feel proud just being next to them. Silence. I feel stable, Abigail finally said. That's not the same thing. Another silence. I walked away from the window. I didn't need to hear the rest. The dinner with her coworkers. There had been 6 of us at the table. Clayton had arrived 5 minutes late, which somehow made his entrance more noticeable. He shook hands with everyone, complimented the restaurant choice, and immediately took over the energy of the table in the way that some people simply can. Not aggressively, not rudely. He just had gravity. I watched Abigail watch him. Not suspiciously. I want to be clear about that. There was nothing inappropriate in how she looked at him, but there was something in it. An alertness. A kind of attention she hadn't directed at me in longer than I could remember. Dinner went on. Clayton told a story about a negotiation he'd been in that week. Everyone leaned in, including me. Actually, it was a good story. At one point he turned to me. Abigail tells me you're in commercial development. That's right, I said. What are you working on? I gave him the short version. A few projects. Some partnerships forming. Things moving carefully but deliberately. He nodded politely. The way people nod when they're waiting for the interesting part. The interesting part, in his framework, never came. Because the interesting part wasn't visible yet. That's the thing about building something real. You spend a long time underground before anyone sees the structure. Clayton, I would eventually understand, never built much underground. Everything he did was designed to be seen immediately. Impressive by appearance. Evaluated on surface contact. But that night, at that dinner table, I was the one who looked ordinary. And the drive home was quiet in a way I recognized. You're not the kind of man women brag about to their friends. I've turned that sentence over in my mind many times since she said it. Not to hurt myself with it. More as a thing to understand. What she meant, I think, is that I didn't have the visible markings of success that create social currency. I didn't have the title that announced itself. I didn't have the profile piece. I didn't have the watch or the table at the right restaurant or the kind of casual financial confidence that performs well at dinner parties. I had plans. I had positions. I had a strategy I'd been building in the dark for years. But none of that creates bragging rights in the moment. None of that lands well when someone asks what your husband does and you need the answer to fit in a sentence. She wasn't entirely wrong about the surface. She was entirely wrong about what was underneath it. I think you've already made a decision, I said, that night in the kitchen. She didn't deny it. I need more than stable, she said. I need to feel like I'm with someone I can point to. You want to be able to point to me. Is that so wrong? I thought about it honestly. No, I said. It's not wrong. It's just not how I'm built. We looked at each other across the kitchen. 6 years. A good apartment. 2 people who had genuinely tried. Okay, I said again. She nodded. And that was the end. No screaming. No dishes thrown. No long speech about everything I'd sacrificed or everything I'd given. Just a quiet okay. And 2 people who had finally stopped pretending they were building the same thing. I moved into a short-term rental about 10 minutes away. Randall came by with food and didn't ask me how I was feeling more than once. He understood that I needed to move, not sit. My attorney Bennett walked me through the separation logistics, which were thankfully straightforward. No children. Assets divided without drama. We weren't cruel to each other at the end, which I'll always give Abigail credit for. The first 2 weeks were strange. Not devastating, just strange. Like arriving in a city you've visited before, but now have to actually navigate alone. I had a lot of quiet. I filled it the only way I knew how. I went back to work. Not to distract myself. To finish. Because here's what Abigail never quite understood. I wasn't stuck. I wasn't treading water. I wasn't the ordinary, invisible, unbragworthy man she'd concluded I was. I was 3 months from the most important business close of my career. 3 months. I just hadn't told anyone. Let me tell you what was actually happening while Abigail was comparing me to Clayton. 18 months before our marriage ended, I had partnered with a man named Preston on a mixed-use development project in a corridor that most people had dismissed as too complicated. Preston believed in the project. I believed in the project. And more importantly, we had spent nearly 2 years doing the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that doesn't make for great dinner party conversation. Zoning reviews, environmental assessments, financing structures, community engagement processes. We had an investor named Sawyer who was patient enough to let us build it correctly. We had a project manager named Carter who never let a detail slip. We had a business mentor named Hudson who'd been through enough cycles to tell us when to press and when to wait. And we had a deal that was moving. Quietly. Without fanfare. The way real things move. 6 weeks after my separation, the first phase closed. Not a profile piece. Not a press release. Just a signed agreement that represented more than I'd ever accumulated before, financially, professionally, and in terms of what it meant for what came next. I called Preston. He said, "We did it." I sat in my rental apartment at 11 o'clock at night and let that settle over me. I thought about the kitchen. I thought about you're not the kind of man women brag about. And then I got up and made coffee and started planning the second phase. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. Things changed after the close. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the way a tide changes, gradually, and then all at once. Sawyer introduced me to a board member named Natalie who ran a development fund focused on urban renewal. She wanted to meet. The meeting led to a conversation. The conversation led to a partnership discussion. A journalist named Sophia reached out through a colleague. She was doing a piece on redevelopment projects that had transformed overlooked corridors. Our project was on her list. I almost declined the interview. Marshall, one of my oldest friends, talked me out of declining. "You spent years building the thing," he said. "Let someone write about it." The piece ran 6 weeks later. It wasn't a profile exactly, more of a feature about the project and the people behind it. But my name was in it. My approach was described in a way that, for the first time, other people could actually see. My phone did something it hadn't done in a while. It rang. Networking organizer Olivia reached out about speaking at an industry gathering. Conference host Harper followed shortly after. A recruiter named Adler called about a board seat that had opened at a firm I respected. I said yes to some things. I said no to others. I wasn't performing. I was just finally visible. And visibility, I learned, is a compounding force. Once people can see what you've built, they start connecting it to what you might build next. I heard things through mutual channels, the way you do in a city where professional circles overlap. Clayton, it turned out, was not building much. The portfolio he referenced at dinner? Largely borrowed leverage. Impressive on paper, fragile underneath. The VP title? Real, but attached to a division that had been underperforming for 2 years. He was good at managing up, less good at managing the actual work. The apartment, the watch, the car, all real. All mortgaged against a version of success that needed constant maintenance to look like what it looked like. I didn't take satisfaction in any of that. I want to be careful to say that clearly. I don't know Clayton. I have no personal quarrel with Clayton. Invisible struggle doesn't make someone a bad person. But I thought about something Randall had said. Mirrors don't produce anything. Clayton had mastered the mirror. I'd spent years on the machinery. I heard from a mutual contact named Catherine that Abigail and Clayton had gotten close for a while after the separation. Nothing she'd confirmed publicly, but the implication was there. And then, apparently, they hadn't. The closeness faded, I heard, somewhere around the time Clayton's professional situation got complicated. Funny how that works. 8 months after our separation, I attended a charity fundraiser for an urban development foundation I'd recently begun supporting. It was a good event. The kind where people actually mean to be there rather than just needing to be seen. I was talking to a real estate partner named Logan when a community leader named Madison pulled me aside to introduce me to a few people she thought I should know. I spent about 20 minutes in a small group conversation about a community project that our development work had indirectly supported, a commercial corridor that had brought local businesses into a neighborhood that hadn't seen investment in decades. The people I was talking to were enthusiastic. They described the impact in specific terms. Jobs created. Storefronts opened. A neighborhood that had started to believe again in its own future. They described the person behind it. The one who'd seen potential where others saw obstacles, who'd built patient relationships with the community before asking anything in return, who'd structured the deal in a way that left equity in local hands. I was that person, but they didn't know that yet. I hadn't introduced myself in any particular way. And then, from across the room, I heard someone say my name. I looked up. Abigail was standing about 15 feet away. She had heard the last part of the conversation. I could tell by the look on her face. Here is what Abigail heard, from strangers, in a room where she hadn't expected to see me. A woman she didn't know said that the development project had changed her business, that a storefront she'd been afraid to open had become financially viable because of the anchor investment in the corridor. A man I didn't recognize talked about the community engagement process, how rare it was for a developer to actually listen rather than just present. Madison described me as someone whose reputation in the field had grown remarkably in the past year. The kind of person, she said, who builds things that matter and then finds out other people have been watching the whole time. A board member who happened to be standing nearby mentioned that she'd heard my name in 3 separate conversations at an industry conference 2 months ago. That's when you know someone's arrived, she said. When you stop hearing about them from one person. I was standing right there, but I was quiet while they talked. And Abigail was frozen in a way I recognized. Not from anything between us, but from the look on her face the night Clayton had told his story at dinner. That alertness, that recalibrating attention, only directed somewhere she hadn't expected. She crossed the room eventually. I'd excused myself from the group and was standing near the windows with a drink in my hand when she reached me. "Hi," she said. "Hi, Abigail." She looked like someone choosing between several different things to say. "I didn't know you'd be here," she finally settled on. "I've been involved with the foundation for a while." She nodded. A pause. "Those people. They were talking about the project. The corridor development." "I know." Another pause. "I didn't know it was you." "Why would you?" I said, not harshly. "I didn't talk about it much." She looked at me for a long moment. I want to tell you there was triumph in that moment. Some quiet satisfaction at the reversal. There wasn't. What I felt was something more like a dull sadness. Not for myself. I was fine. I was better than fine. But for the gap, the distance between what she had believed about me and what had been true the entire time. And the way that gap had cost both of us something we couldn't get back. "You were building this," she said. "The whole time." "The whole time," I confirmed. She opened her mouth. Closed it. "I should get back," I said, gently but clearly. She nodded. "Right. Of course." I set my glass down and walked back toward the group. I didn't look back. Not out of coldness, but because there was genuinely nothing left in that direction. I know some of what happened after the fundraiser because Catherine told Randall, and Randall told me only the parts he thought I needed to hear. Abigail called Savannah on the drive home. She told her what she'd witnessed. Savannah, to her credit, apparently said something honest. "You always talked about Clayton like he was the standard, but you never really looked closely at the standard." Abigail was quiet for a while. "I thought stability was the problem," she said. What do you think now? No answer. Or at least, not one that made it back to me. What I do know is this. In the months after the fundraiser, something settled in Abigail. A kind of stillness that people noticed. Her friend Rebecca called Randall once. An unusual enough occurrence that he mentioned it. Just to say that Abigail seemed like she was processing something heavy. I hope she processed it well. I genuinely mean that. People sometimes expect a redemption arc to involve a moment where the person who underestimated you witnesses your success, and you get to feel large in their smallness. That's not how it felt. Growth felt like a Tuesday morning call with Sawyer about Phase 2 financing. It felt like a handshake with Logan after finalizing a new property partnership. It felt like sitting across from Natalie at a board meeting and knowing that I belonged in that room. Not because someone had declared it, but because I had built my way there over years of work that no one was watching. It felt like Sophia's article being referenced in a panel discussion I attended, with someone in the audience who didn't know me describing the project as exactly the kind of development philosophy the city needs more of. It felt like Hudson, my mentor, calling to say simply, "You did the hard thing right. That's rarer than you think." It felt like nothing to prove. That's the most honest thing I can tell you. By the time the world started seeing what I had built, I had already stopped needing it to. The validation felt good. I won't pretend otherwise. But it wasn't filling a hole. It was confirming what I already knew was there. That's a different thing entirely. I ran into Clayton once. Industry event. Different context than the dinner. He was there in a capacity that was a step or two below where he'd been at the time I knew of him. He was still polished. Still wore the watch. Still had the handshake that fills the room. But there was something different in his eyes. The kind of thing you see in people who have been performing a version of themselves for so long that they've started to sense the gap between the performance and the substance. He recognized me. Came over. We spoke briefly. He was cordial. I was cordial. At some point he said, offhandedly, "I heard about what you put together. That corridor project. Impressive work." "Thank you," I said. He nodded. Moved on. I didn't need more than that. And I noticed, as he walked away, that I felt nothing particular about him. No resentment. No satisfaction at the contrast. Just a passing acknowledgement that the world sorts itself out in the long run, if you give it enough time and do the actual work. It's been a little over a year since the fundraiser. I live in a different apartment now, one I chose for myself, not for proximity to someone else's office. Preston and I have moved into Phase 2. Carter manages a team of 7. We brought on a consultant named Brooks to help scale the model to other corridors. Evelyn, a client I met through Natalie's network, has become a significant partner on a project we'll be announcing later this year. I have a life that feels, and this is the only word for it, mine. Not performing. Not adjacent. Not waiting to be seen. Building. Always building. Randall came over for dinner a few months ago and looked around the apartment, at the plans spread across the table, the notes on the whiteboard, the general evidence of someone in the middle of making something. And he said, "You look like yourself." I thought about that for a while after he left. He was right. I looked like myself because I finally was only myself. Not a comparison. Not a contrast. Not an absence of something else. Just a man who had been quietly building something real in the dark and had lived long enough to see it come into the light. Abigail is doing fine, from what I understand. She's taken on a new role at a different company. Moved to a different part of the city. I hope she found what she was looking for. I hope she found someone she can point to, or better yet, someone who makes her stop caring about pointing altogether. As for me, I learned something from all of it. Not about Abigail. Not about Clayton. About the particular danger of being invisible to the wrong person. When someone who is supposed to know you best looks at you and sees ordinary, and you know, in the part of yourself that doesn't lie, that you are not ordinary, you have two choices. You can spend your energy trying to be seen by them, or you can spend it finishing what you started. I chose the second one. And the strange, quiet gift of that choice is this. By the time the world finally sees you clearly, you no longer need the validation. You've already moved on to the next thing. You're already building. She spent years admiring what looked successful, only to realize she had walked away from what actually was.